Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hardcore Finance Podcast. Today in the podcast, we have two very, very special guests, Dan Goldstern, Dojo, and we're bringing back Eyal, who is entrepreneur extraordinaire. Today, we're going to talk about and focus on real estate, specifically New York real estate, which got really decimated post the coronavirus pandemic. We're going to talk macro and micro. Macro focusing on what are the new investment pockets, what's happening in New York in terms of human flows, office flows, residential and commercial real estate, and then focus on micro and think about CapEx and what do companies have to do and how do they have to invest in their office space post pandemic and as people come back to work. This episode is brought to you by the book Inventing Bitcoin. If you guys haven't gotten into Bitcoin yet, you know that Shimon and I talk about Bitcoin a lot on the podcast. That's a great way to store your wealth. And we really believe it. We're not just shilling it to shill it. It's really going to be the future of money. And to really understand Bitcoin in a simple way, get the book Inventing Bitcoin. It's written by a good friend and longtime Bitcoiner Jan Pritzker, who's a co-founder of Swan Bitcoin, one of the players in the Bitcoin space. But the book is a fantastic, quick read about what is blockchain, what is Bitcoin, why is Bitcoin so important, and really will give you all the basics. So check out Inventing Bitcoin. You can get it on Audible, you can get it on Amazon, and really any other places in many different languages that you get your books. So Inventing Bitcoin, check it out. So Dan and Gil, welcome to the podcast. I'm really glad you guys are here. And let me do a quick bio on both of you for our listeners who haven't been here or haven't listened to the episode about celebrities with Gil, but a quick bio on Gil. Gil and I are classmates from our business school days in Kellogg. He started as a digital marketer. And from 2010, he started pushing the idea of essentially celebrity influencers and has become one of the world's foremost experts in influencer marketing. He started a company called Hyper, ended up selling it, and now is advising the Silverstein properties on various aspects of investments and real estate investments. So he's perfect to talk to us about the macro landscape. Dan, on the other hand, is the co-founder of Dojo. And in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, he's been working with business leaders across industries to reimagine the future of work and the changing role of the actual office. His previous experiences include working on economic development, labor, housing policy in the New York mayor's office, and on a large-scale real estate development projects, also with the Silverstein properties. And now he's proudly locking down in Brooklyn, New York. So welcome both.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Perfect. Well, why don't we kick it off and go over to Dan. Dan, I mean, Dojo, the way the company started, so interesting. And I love the premise behind it. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is this new niche in the market, this post-pandemic office space or reimagining the office space? Can you tell us a little bit more about what you've been doing?
Yeah, of course. So the last, how long has it been? The last 9 months have been the biggest change in the way people work in over a century. And we've learned that a lot of things about it don't work, but we've also learned that a lot of things do work. And companies, virtually all companies, are going through a process right now where they need to plan for the next step. And in many cases, that's going to involve coming back to the office. But in also many cases, that's going to involve integrating some of the remote working or hybrid working models that they've learned in recent months. That's going to have a pretty major change on the office market. And what Dojo's doing is actually helping those companies using our AI platform, helping those companies find efficiencies in their space and plan and design their workplaces to make people more effective.
I see. That's fascinating. And so just a quick follow-up on that. briefly, when are you expecting people to fully come back to the office? Do you have a point of view on that?
Nobody knows. The last year has just been a process of people setting a line in the sand and then just like walking straight past it. The reality is, a lot of companies already have some people back in the office, and that's not a particularly large amount. But the approach most are taking are phasing. Right, it's not going to be like the end of World War II. There's there's V-Day, everybody celebrates and goes back to normal. It's going to be a phased approach where step by step companies bring back larger and larger portions of their workforce.
I see. And so if we actually zoom out, it's interesting you talked about the line in the sand and how it's drawn and you keep pushing past it. We're kind of entering this hybrid model, right? Of some people in, some people out. When we zoom out and think about it from a macro point of view, what are we seeing? What's happening, at least in the New York area, with commercial real estate, with residential real estate? Are people still staying in Manhattan? Are they moving out to the suburbs? What are some interesting, what are the shifts that are happening with real estate in general?
I think it's definitely something that, the answer to this question will change every month. But as a response to the pandemic, what we immediately saw was a transition of a lot of people that used to live in the city because they had to go to work in the city, reconsider their options because suddenly everybody was working remotely. So what we saw initially was a massive movement outside of the city into less expensive, less pandemic affected areas. And what we're seeing right now is a trickle back into the city. It's been interesting from both a commercial and residential perspective because on residential, obviously, people are not sure what to do. Prices have dropped because there's less competition and buildings are offering different concessions. But if you want to come back to the city and you don't need to come back right now, are you risking the opportunity to sign a lower cost deal by waiting another 3 or 4 months? On the commercial side, I think people are waiting to see vaccines really take effect before everybody comes back to the city. But we're seeing companies have very different approaches. Certain companies saying we're never going to come back into the office, and companies saying I can't wait to come back into the office. And I think it varies by industry and varies by the specific perspective of that, of the person running the company or the company's culture. The result is that as a company, we have to prepare for a different world, a world where not everyone automatically owns an office or not everyone automatically uses an office for 5 days a week. And we have to create a much more flexible product, which is something that, as you can imagine, the real estate industry is not accustomed to doing.
Yeah, and so there's a couple of interesting things that you talked about there, never coming back, and then this concept of not being in full capacity, essentially. Some people are going to be working remotely. I want to touch upon that. But let's park it for a second because we're going to bring Dan in. I think Dan is a great expert here. So we'll talk about that. But just a double click on the New York area. Are you seeing, so residentially people are moving out, but now it's a little bit of a game theory, right? About, do I come back and get good deals early? Or do I wait, right, to get more information coming out of there? Are you seeing any specific pockets of the city, blossoming or recovering faster than others?
I wouldn't say that there's, a fast recovery anywhere in the city right now. I think what's happened is that a lot of residential companies divided up into innovative companies. WeWork's not a good example, but WeWork style thinking. Okay, how can we, what can we offer that we haven't offered before? What can we do that's going to get people to be attracted? Even something as simple as a flexible deal is very rare in the real estate world. The ability to close the deal early or to leave early is something that you don't see often. And you're seeing a lot of experimentation on it, whether it's giving 3 months as concessions, whether it's giving other benefits, or, in our case, what we did is we decided to up our service levels and anywhere from helping you move into the building, or doing it at our cost, or offering a variety of services that we didn't offer before, because we understand now that we're competing for a smaller pool.
Just a quick clarification. When you say we, you mean Silverstein Properties?
Our residential properties, yeah. But I actually mean us as an industry. I can talk about the innovation that we're putting in, but as an industry, we're seeing a lot more flexibility from companies that in New York, it used to be very simple. This is the price. We're at 99% capacity. If you want an apartment, we'll let you know when one becomes available. That's changed dramatically to a market that's much more competitive, and not everybody in this industry is prepared for that. There are companies that are highly leveraged, and changing their price structure would be very, very difficult. There are companies that are public companies. And so the industry, and of course, the industry is filled with people who have operated in a certain way for a very long time and wouldn't have changed the way they operate unless the industry changes very quickly. So it's a really interesting race to see who adapts quickly enough. And specifically about neighborhoods in New York, look, the popular neighborhoods are always doing better than the less popular neighborhoods. The neighborhoods that are suffering are, for example, ones that would, or especially suffering are ones that would house college students like NYU or Columbia, where people would move into the city so they could live close to university, and they're not going to university physically. Those neighborhoods are suffering significantly, but I think it's across the board. I can't say there's a major recovery yet. We are seeing signs of oil.
So one thing that made me think about when you talked about offering as an industry more services is, do you think this will create, almost like a renaissance in terms of service type jobs, concierge type jobs, or other, maybe even gig economy type jobs that buildings would offer their tenants? So you said help with movers, right? Or help moving in, or maybe offering some more concierge services to lure people in and give them some more value adds. Do you see any on a micro level, this micro trend, if you will, of a certain job type that's going to be highly in demand?
Look, I mean, working in real estate has a very big variety of income that it generates to the people who work in it. So these jobs don't tend to be very highly paid jobs. With that said, there's an opportunity for business-oriented people to come up with ideas that help buildings adapt, because, as we mentioned, this is probably one of the most ancient and unrelenting industries where a lot of the owners have been operating in a very specific way. So there's an opportunity to, for somebody who's a tech provider, like Dojo, for example, to come in and solve a big problem for you, and then as a real estate owner, you're willing to pay to have that solved. We've seen companies. One company I saw is a company called Tulu, which creates a special wall in your building where people can share products that it's not worthwhile to own, like a big vacuum cleaner or other products, or like a electric bike. So we're seeing different innovations in the space, but I don't know if specifically I would say go to college and learn how to be a concierge person because of this. At least not yet. But I definitely think that we're seeing a shift in the way people are thinking about how they can provide value to their tenants and earn their trust.
Gil, I got a question for you. Back to the neighborhood question. What do you think of the governor's plan to convert office to residential in certain parts of the city? Do you think that's going to be healthy for the industry?
I think it comes from an understanding that the demand for commercial is going to go down, and the belief is that the demand for residential in New York will recover because it's not only driven by people who work in the city, it's the greatest city in the world, and I will not accept any arguments about that. For tourists, for fashion. Right, for fashion, for tourists, for anybody who comes to the U.S., New York's a stop. Sorry, that's my dog. Anyone who comes to the U.S., New York's a stop for them. And it's definitely a place where we strongly believe people want to come back and live in. So it's really a way to help a lot of the commercial owners redefine how they can make an income, or how they can make a living off of their real estate without losing and then reducing the competition, especially for the traditional real estate, not the high costing Class A office space. So I think it's a good plan. I think it's a drop in the bucket, but it's a good plan.
So it's interesting to hear you guys talk about this. And I want to come back to one point about recoveries. So when COVID started, it would have been, in retrospect, a good bet from an investing perspective to short the New York commercial real estate market. I don't remember how much it dropped. I think 30 or 40% back at the end of March and beginning of April. Now, as we think about, buildings coming back and some commercial being transitioned into residential, do you guys think this will be a V-shaped recovery, so to speak, or more of a prolonged recovery? And the caveat here is, let's not take March as a starting point. Let's take today as a starting point, right? Because now we have the vaccines that are starting to be rolled out. We've kind of gotten used to or adapted to the whole COVID situation. The market has settled, right? In March and April, in May, it was just a panic, right? A free for all, especially in New York, because New York got hit extremely hard. So going forward from today on, do we expect a fast recovery? Do we expect a slow and lingering recovery? And if we just think about real estate kind of overall, kind of to where it was, do you guys believe that the market will come back and real estate prices will come back to where they were before, and when?
I feel like I'm hogging the conversation, but I'll try to answer that one. I think it's very hard to look at real estate as an industry because there's such a variety of players in the space. I think in general, the industry is going to linger for a while because it's not just COVID. There's a change in the way people are thinking. People are open. People are open to different working scenarios. They're working from home, working partially. In addition, they're willing to live outside the city, or they're not necessarily willing to pay the cost of living in the city. So it is a staggered recovery that's going to affect the industry. I think companies who know how to adapt thrive in these scenarios because that's going to be for the companies that really want a safe environment and have these priorities. They're going to look at owners who have Dojo installed because they're going to worry about how do I bring back my employees. For residential buildings that are not thinking about how do we build a better experience living in our building? How do we make sure that people really love being part of this community that we're building? But instead of just temporarily dropping prices, recovery is going to take a very long time. It's not a very simple industry. You can't just drop prices and raise prices the next day like in some other industries. Wait for the industry to recover and drop prices and raise prices. If you've dropped prices, you're under scrutiny, and you have and there are laws that prohibit you from raising prices more than a certain percentage every year. So it's a very tough industry to navigate, and I don't think it'll just bounce back. Again, this is not investment advice. I did not short the industry, and I am not planning on investing in the industry other than working in the industry. Right now, I'm not an investment expert, so I don't know what the recovery would look like. But as an industry, it's not ready to just bounce back, and I don't think the demand is there to just bounce back. I think the companies that have been proactive like ours are going to do a lot better.
I'll add to that, Gil, and I'll speak a bit about the commercial side. I think if you look at offices and you look at retail, people's behaviors have changed. And the longer this goes on, and I don't think this summer, like I said, I don't think this summer is that line in the sand where everybody all of a sudden bounces back. It's a gradual process. But the longer this goes on, the longer people get used to their behaviors, the longer people continue doing their shopping on Instacart, the longer people continue figuring out great ways to work remotely. And that's going to affect demand. And will demand over time catch back up to the supply that's available? Yes. Will new businesses emerge to take up the spaces that are available in the city? Yes, but that's going to take time. So I don't see this being quick by any stretch.
So I have this thesis I want to run by you guys, and it'll be a little bit long-winded for you guys and our listeners. So Sorry in advance, but there's a reason for that. So when I think about investing and I think about just general economics, and I look at the US versus the rest of the world, I almost feel like many times the laws of physics or the laws of finance, so to speak, don't really apply to the US. So for example, we can print a lot of money and not see a ton of inflation, at least in consumable goods. We can have, we can have government shutdowns and not really get hit on our credit rating, and so on and so forth. There are many of these examples. And I think the reason why this is the case is because, when it's bad everywhere, the US is a place where it's least bad. It's literally my hypothesis here is that it's in kind of finance and investing in economics, it's really the top player and everyone else. It doesn't matter if you're number 2 or you're number 10, really. It's really, do you have the top economy where there's a flight to safety in terms of investment, or everyone else? And the reason why I say this is because I feel like New York is like that with real estate. It's like New York. Maybe there are a couple other major hubs in the world, but really New York and everyone else. So when we think about, Gil, your point of when people come visit the US, they always come back to New York. So you're always going to have tourism flowing through that city, right? You're always going to have industry flowing in that city. Even San Francisco with tech can't touch the stickiness of attention and travel and desire to live that New York has. And so when we talk about kind of investing, pulling, zooming out, I think New York is very, very unique that no matter how long the recovery takes, and Dan, you're right, there are fundamental shifts in terms of shopping in Instacart and Amazon that won't go away for a very long time, if ever. But New York almost is primed to recover faster than anywhere else. Like I think about Chicago or even very, very attractive cities in terms of weather and livability like Miami. It's easier to live farther away, to move away from the city. And I think those cities, Boston, DC for that matter, are going to recover much slower than Manhattan specifically in New York. And so do you guys agree, disagree? How does that resonate with you all if we zoom out a little bit? And I know you guys are more of experts about New York, but just, hypothesizing here in terms of where the pockets of investment could be.
Well, I think that if you look at New York's previous crisis in the 70s and the 80s and the recovery that happened after that, I don't think this is exactly comparable. That was a fiscal and financial crisis in the city, and it was just very difficult to get out of it. This fundamentally is driven by the pandemic. It's a health crisis, so it's solvable like a health crisis. But I think that over time you see, of course, New York recovering and playing the same role that it did before as a hub for people to gather and live closely to each other and exchange ideas and all of that. And I personally believe that there's a much larger historical trend that's been going on really since the Industrial Revolution, which is human beings are moving closer and closer to each other. And I think that is definitely going to go on, but I think you can get small blips on that trend. And I don't know for certain that New York is going to recover faster than some of these other cities. There's some livability differences between them. Even though I would agree that over time, New York is going to stay in that number one position.
My perspective, I have this thing called I look at when I try to understand market leadership, right, is a really important thing. And I agree with you. The U.S. is the market leader in being a country. You could say it's not the greatest country in the world. Some people have better healthcare, but at the end of the day, it's the most stable and free country of the big. You might have small examples of better places to live, but in general, I don't think anyone living in the U.S. really expects the U.S. to collapse anytime soon. And I think it's most likely to survive pretty much anything. that humanity has to offer. I think the same applies to New York. And I kind of look at, when I think about this stuff, market leadership, I look for signals. So like if you're competing with other tech companies, how many mentions do they get in the press? Like if you're the most well-known company in your space, every time somebody writes about your space, they're going to also mention your company. So if they're talking about self-driving cars, somehow Tesla always gets mentioned, right? Even if nobody's writing about Tesla or talked about Tesla. If you're back in the day when you were talking about shared office spaces, WeWork was always mentioned. WeWork was always mentioned when you were talking about shared office spaces. And so the result is that, sorry guys, give me a break 1 second.
We're going to need to soon talk about pets at work and pets in the home office. But during COVID, hearing kids and pets and others is pretty usual. So Gil, don't worry.
Sorry about that. So what I was going to say is, like, if you look at New York, the amount of songs that were written on about a city, or if you did a poll right now and you asked every tourist where's the place that they want to go most, anybody who's never left their country, where do you want to go? Where's your dream place to go? They're going to say New York, a lot of them, or a large portion of them. So in general, I would say I agree that New York is a good candidate to recover. It's an expensive city. It's got its own problems. And it will 100% recover. Will it be the fastest one? It's hard to say. I have no doubt that it will recover.
Yeah, so I kind of tend to agree. Now, if I'm thinking about, I like the point about it's not the fastest one. It could have, like, Wichita, Kansas could recover quicker, but I think on a macro level, given the size, the TAM of opportunity that's in New York is probably the best risk reward investment for recovery that there is, at least in the U.S. in my opinion. So I'd love to focus a little bit more on micro now, because we talked about a couple of things about, Instacart and Amazon, and the fact that the pandemic has changed work life permanently, really. And one of the things that we promised to come back to when we said earlier on is that, hey, look, some companies are never coming back to the office, right? And the office occupancy will likely never be, or at least in the near future, be at the same 100% as it was before. So I want to turn this over to Dan. So Dan, can you tell me a little bit more, I guess maybe two things, right? One is, what exactly, how do you with Dojo, how do you guys plan this post-pandemic world? And then how do you, let's start there. And then how do you see companies, like, do we see most companies coming back to like 80%, some companies coming back to 50%? Because what I want to understand later on is, if I'm evaluating a company, how should I evaluate the saved expenses, right, from having office space to the incurred expenses of, planning the workaround, the workflow, and so on? This is really a big riddle for me, and I don't know how to value that.
Yeah, so Dojo is an AI platform that tailors a workplace and tailors a workforce model for a company based on the way that they actually do work. I'll dive into that deeper, but I want to tell you why that's important. The reason that's important is your second question. There are three types of companies right now. There are companies that are 100% definitely coming back to the office. Some of them are already back in the office. Silverstein is a good example. Then there are companies that are 100% definitely not coming back to the office. And you've got some of the companies on the West Coast that are doing this or talking about it, Twitter being prominent, Dropbox. And then you've got the sort of silent majority. And this is the vast majority of companies. They don't know yet what's right for them. They probably lean towards coming back to the office. There's a lot of momentum behind that, and there are a lot of great reasons to come back. But they also know that there's an opportunity here. They just don't quite know what it is and how they would execute it. So Dojo is all about data, and it's all about customizing it, because every company is totally different in this regard. It's not enough to say, oh, I'm a tech company, so I should probably work from home, like Twitter, or the opposite. Every company has different teams and different individuals within it that work according to different workflows. Dojo is about modeling that, building literally a model of how people collaborate with each other, how individuals spend their time and get their work done, and analyzing the existing footprint, the existing offices of that company, to try to find either opportunities to increase the efficiency of the real estate. And there are some great opportunities now to reduce space by moving to a hybrid model, or by having some groups and some people work from home or remotely part of the time, or even all of the time. We're working with a number of companies that are thinking about strategic locations. This goes hand in hand with the residential conversation that we were having. New York's expensive. Why if certain groups can get their work done remotely, or maybe they need to meet amongst each other, but they don't need to meet with the folks in the headquarters, they really need to be based in New York. Maybe they can be in New Jersey. Maybe they can be in Miami. So all of that is a really important conversation happening inside of virtually every company right now. And the outcome is going to depend on the culture of the company, but it's also going to depend on the actual way that they get work done.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. How do I evaluate the different OpEx changes, like different costs of running kind of day to day for some of these businesses? And I agree. Let's take the ones that are definitely in and definitely out of the office off the table for now. But you're right. There's this gigantic in between, especially as these hybrid models. I remember when I used to be at the Boston Consulting Group, and actually KPMG before that, we had a thing called hoteling. You had open space, and you would check in when you're in the office and check out when you're not. And you kind of shared a space or a desk or an area with other people. And it worked 99% of the time. It worked absolutely fine. I mean, there were congestions sometimes, but that happened very, very rarely. And I was always surprised that other companies don't do the same. But how do you expect? I guess there's two trends, right? Like how are these costs? How are they going to change? And then the second one is some companies are locked into office space because they sign leases for 5-10 years. And so if you sign a 10-year lease and you have this floor space that you expect the people to come in all the time, what are they going to do with this floor space, with the extra space?
Yeah, both great questions. So let's start by talking about utilization. Before March 2020, average office utilization was 60, 70% at most. So companies even then knew that a sizable chunk of what they were paying for, and this is really expensive stuff, a sizable chunk of what they were paying for was not being used by employees. Right? Today, those numbers are way, way down. And in part, that's not in part. That is because of the pandemic, but that has sent a signal to companies. Well, if we can continue operating without using 90% of our space, what does that mean? What can we learn from this? So I think the real place that you want to focus on is office utilization. And there, like you said, there are a couple of tactics or a couple of methods for gaining efficiency. So hoteling, hot desking, any form of hybrid. I think that's the big category here. Any form of a hybrid model is going to help a company get more bang for its buck for every square foot. If you know that employees typically need to come into the office 1, 2, 3 days out of the week, but not all 5, they can share those same spaces. Our offices have been designed basically the same way for 100 years. The idea is that every person gets their own desk, and those desks take up a ton of space. If that space can be converted to collaborative space types for people who are coming in to have a meeting, to whiteboard, that's also going to be a much better driver of effectiveness for people. So you're not just looking at OpEx, but you're also looking at top line. And I think a lot of companies are taking that seriously. It's sort of a balance for them between those two things. To your second question, I think depending on where a company is in its lease cycle, it's going to have to come up with a different strategy. A company that just signed a big lease is going to think about subleasing. A company that has a lease rolling, to Gil's point from before, is going to think twice before re-signing for that same amount of space. So I think it's going to totally depend. And then you've got very large global enterprises that are thinking about this at a completely different scale. If they can move people to what are called today satellite offices, if they can move people to regional offices, they can find great efficiencies in their OpEx. over time. But that's also a process. It's about moving people, which is hard, but it's about deciding where to hire people in the future. Do I hire in New York, pay a New York salary, pay somebody pay for a desk in a New York office, or do I make my next hire in Salt Lake City?
Yeah, I mean, I think on top of that, one of the things that really matters is your ability to actually bring people in, because I think today, when there's people are just afraid to come back, even if you want your entire company to come back, people are going to say that they're concerned about getting sick. So there's technology solutions like what Dojo offers. But there's also just a psychological thing where people have to transition. And the result is that even companies that want to come back today and want to be working full time are struggling. I want to touch on the idea of hoteling. You know, Boston Consulting Group is a perfect example for a company that should be hoteling, right? You guys, as the consultants, were traveling from client to client. They're in the office when they're in the office, and they're not in the office on other days. And so hoteling was very native to that industry. And I imagine, I'd never worked for any of those companies. I imagine it's the same thing with McKinsey and Bain and all the other companies. It's a very similar environment. Other companies are really going to have to revisit the way that they've always thought about working. And one of the senses you hear is either, and you never know how to predict it, is either, wow, I hate that everybody's working from home, I can't run anything, or completely the other way around, which is, I can't believe how simple working from home turned out to be. So as an industry, we have to understand that we have to provide flexible solutions and flexible ideas for companies, because not every company is going to need that same solution. And as a landlord, you know, you have to understand that just because we have a long-term lease doesn't mean that you can just for the next 7 years not offer any innovation.
There's a couple interesting points there, and maybe we can explore really quickly which industries that we think are prone for hoteling and which ones aren't. But the whole point of, you know, landlords can't sit still, and maybe that's I think that's absolutely right. And so this is with every kind of crisis comes a moment of innovation. And one of the things for folks looking to invest, I think, would be to look at the real estate market overall, outside of looking at different cities and just looking into REITs or actual buying property. It might be looking into big landlords, like, let's say, Silverstein Properties and others, that are pushing forward interesting and innovative ideas, as well as companies like Dojo, you know, kind of being born into solving this, the coronavirus, the crisis, or coming back to work crisis. Like we said, we've seen for sure Zoom, balloon in terms of valuation, right? A lot of the collaborative tools have, but that's just, solving problem number one of, oh man, I have to get my work done. So how do I talk to my coworkers? Now that we're going to come back and, whether we'll have masks, who's going to get vaccinated, who won't? Can you force vaccinations on people? Will this be an endemic? What's going to happen with the next, viral, pandemic? Because pandemics happen more often than we think. It's just this one was really, really bad. But the swine flu was technically a pandemic. But when these other things come out, can we invest in a real estate company or landlord or management property company that's looking to innovate, that's becoming aggressive? And maybe looking at early signs now is an interesting play in the long run to put your chips or invest with them and bet that they will continue to take share because they're unique and they're on the forefront of this innovation. And like you said, this industry hasn't really had much innovation in a long time. You had typical broker, you had the real estate company, the construction company, and it's been a very stale relationship, I think, for a while. I don't know if this resonates with you guys.
Yeah, it's just not an industry that's easily prone. Your building is where your building is. You can break down the walls, you can make it more fancy, you could break it down and rebuild the building. But generally, any innovation requires a significant amount of investment. It's not like startups where you go on AWS and you buy a server and you do, and you create innovation. That's why this industry is really susceptible and open to companies like Dojo that can risk, can innovate, can try things, have access to data from multiple landlords. As a landlord, you only know what's going on in your property and a little bit about what's going on in neighboring properties or what you can get from the news. And nobody's going to share that information with you. But when you're a company like Dojo, you have access to this information to understand what's happening in the market. So I think what we're going to see, at least, for us, is much bigger openness to working with startup companies, looking for these people who come from innovation, because the people who typically work at real estate companies have great qualities. They're very good with finances. They know how to design very well. They know how to sell a building, but they never needed to be innovative. So I think it's an opportunity. It's a chance to look at prop tech and say, prop tech's becoming much more important than it used to be. There are a lot more people who will potentially be customers and potentially buy these companies. And are we which of these companies is solving a real big problem? Anywhere from, reducing costs for the building, making them more attractive, increasing customer stickiness with the building so customers won't leave. So from my perspective, Dan is kind of on the flip side. I'm very high level thinking about the metrics that you would think of at a traditional SaaS provider. I'm thinking about, what does it cost us to acquire a customer? How do we ensure that their satisfaction level is always at a 9 or a 10? How do we build a relationship with them and ensure that we have things to offer in our building that's going to make it a difficult decision for somebody else to come in and just offer them a lower price so that they move at the end of the lease? Those are the things that we're thinking of as a company. And it comes with this understanding that we have to take a lot more responsibility towards our tenants. Companies like Dan's, I think, are really interesting for us. And I meet, multiple companies every week looking for companies that can offer us a solution for something we could never solve on our own.
So are you looking specifically to invest? So Dan, just one quick question for Gil. Are you looking specifically to invest in real estate tech?
That's not my specific job. I focus on identifying opportunities for the future and partnering with the companies. There are people at Silverstein who can decide to invest in some of the companies we work with. My focus is finding the ideal partners that can help us find a solution for challenges that we hear from our tenants. So the classic example, of course, Dojo. Dojo predated me at Silverstein, but Dojo solves an issue with hoteling and with understanding how can we bring employees into our real estate safely and create the confidence that nothing will happen to them, and make them feel like this is a space where they can work comfortably. But it also creates for us an opportunity to retain customers, because anybody who doesn't have Dojo is at disadvantage. Any other competitor building, and the alternative that they might go to.
Yeah, Gil, that's perfect. I'm glad you said the word retention at the end there. I think that's really what, new leases aren't being signed today. The thing that a lot of the real estate companies are focused on is retention. And previously that was kind of taken for granted. If a company's healthy, if it's growing, or, if it's even just kind of staying the same size, when the lease comes up, it's that company is going to renew the space. But today, what if you're running leasing, or if you're running asset management at one of these companies, what do you say when a tenant comes to you and says, our employees are doing pretty fine working from home, we're not in a rush to get back? That's scary. And prop tech is one of the great ways for real estate companies to communicate and to connect with their tenants in a different way. You're not just talking about the intrinsic qualities of the space. These windows are great, that view's fantastic, but you're actually getting on their level, and you're able to talk to them about their business and the effectiveness of their people, right? So that's one of the things that Dojo facilitates, that type of conversation, when the conversation is kind of in a language that the CEO or the CFO of the tenant understands and wants to speak. How do we become more successful?
So if our listeners want to understand more about where to find investment opportunities with emerging real estate technology companies, obviously outside of Dojo, but Dojo is a great example. But where can they look? How do they discover new and emerging companies in the space?
So, I don't typically do direct investments in this space, but I will say, because of my role, but I will say this, the fact that a company was selected by a big player like Silverstein, I can't speak for other big players, and is doing a pilot with them is a great way to get introduced. One is seeing what the buildings have to offer and saying, okay, how are you doing this? Oh, there's a company that provides you with this service. How happy are you with it? What is it doing? Why did you choose to partner with them? Because we're forced to really give these guys pilots that we may not have had to do before, or try things that we weren't happy to try before. So I think in general, one place to look is just go into the buildings and see what's new. Like, what kind of technology that we bring into it? Anywhere from, buttonless elevators to screens that you can talk to technology that helps you understand who should sit where, like in Dojo's case, to ordering food through your phone that comes into the building with a very specific path so that nobody can touch it on the way. There's a lot of technology in companies like Tulu that I mentioned before, where they give the tenants an opportunity to not spend a lot of space on stuff that they can share with other tenants, and they do all the cleaning and all the sanitizing. So you want to look at these companies that are working with the big landowners or the real estate owners, and say, okay, there's a reason why they were chosen, because we talk to everyone in the space before we choose the vendor. And then there's a great way to see how this pilot's going and whether they plan on expanding it or not.
I had a really quick thought is, on the flip side, if you should be, people should be looking at, it's going to become a prisoner's dilemma almost. If a big real estate company doesn't offer these services, right, or is not tied to some of these emerging players like Dojo, then your workers aren't going to want to come back to the office. And if it's critical for you for collaboration purposes, maybe you're a creative agency, maybe you do like design workshops, or maybe you lead leadership workshops, it's going to be hard for you to retain your employees or have them come back if you're not offering these services. So it's going to become a prisoner's dilemma, which is, again, a great space to be in if you're an emerging company, if you're a startup in the space. Guys, I know we have to wrap. I want to quickly ask, how do people get in touch with you if they want to find out more about you, about Dojo? I think it's dojo.co. That's the website. But tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you.
That's the website. Anybody listening to this, just shoot me an email, dan@dojo.co, and I'd be happy to chat with you.
Fantastic. And Gil, I don't know if you want to give out your information.
Yeah.
If you want to find out more,
my email is geyal@silvprop, silvprop.com. And yes, anybody, you're welcome to reach out to me with if you're a startup in this space, definitely reach out to me. If you're looking for pilots or an opportunity to work residential or commercial. And if you're planning on investing, if you want completely mediocre advice, feel free to reach out to me.
Everyone always wants completely mediocre advice. Well, look, guys, we talked about macro landscape, New York rebounding, micro landscape. I think the most important thing is to take away here is, if you're looking to invest, look for real estate properties, management companies that are going to be in the forefront, that are thinking ahead, that are trying to innovate, that are partnering with companies like Dojo. And those are going to be the leaders that are going to endure in this next phase of working and living, really. So Gil, Dan, thank you so much for chatting. Thanks for being on the podcast. Guys, hardcorefinance.com. Tweet at Shimon Lazarov. Tweet at me at Mr. Ibida. And we love to hear your feedback for Gil, for Dan, for us. And thanks for listening. Thank you both.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome.